This really is kind of any hammer needs an anvil, and any anvil is useless without a hammer. And so we got to get both parts of those right. The discussion of whether it's going to be a focus on defense, kind of inherent resilience, or a focus on imposing consequences is a false choice.
Welcome to Cyber Focus from the McCrary Institute, where we explore the people and ideas shaping and defending our digital world. I'm your host, Frank Cilluffo, and I'm joined this week by one of my co-chairs, Chris Inglis, who is a leader in all things cyber, former deputy director of the National Security Agency, a decorated veteran of the U.S. Air Force, the nation's first national cyber director, and now involved in a major effort by the National Academy of Sciences. But we're here this week to discuss a paper we released just before the holidays. U.S. Cyber Policy, Offense, Deterrence, and Strategic Competition. Chris was one of our co-chairs, along with General Frank McKenzie and Tom Bossert, and we're going to drill deep into the study. So, Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Frank. Thanks very much for the opportunity.
Chris, so I thought we'd start a little bit contextual and maybe on the substance itself. I hope everyone actually does download and read the report, but what were some of the big takeaways from your perspective as to why we jumped into this, and more importantly, what some of our findings were?
Yeah, so I think, well, first of all, thank you for the pleasure and the privilege of being a part of that effort. I learned a lot in it, and I think it's a really important opportunity to describe how we got where we are, but more importantly, to lay a foundation for what we might do forward. I love the title of it to start with, because offense, deterrence, and strategic competition is in part a declarative statement, which is we're in an age of strategic competition, and cyber is in full play. It is an instrument of power. And the offense and deterrence being employed by others is not asymmetrically, or it's not being done by us in equal measure. You know, I think when you look at the great power competition that's ongoing at the moment, think about China, Russia, the United States as being the principal players in that, not the only, but the principal players. China and Russia are way ahead of us in terms of thinking about how they might use cyber as an instrument of power, fully integrated with other instruments of power. That's not to say that we don't have game. We've got some extraordinary capabilities, but we haven't integrated those in the same way. And so strategic competition is a reality. Offense and deterrence really is the subject matter of that report. And I find upon my reread of the report, which I helped to write, I've learned things in terms of how to stitch that together as a basis for consideration going forward.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm glad you brought that up. This was really to set the stage. It was long on explaining where we are, how we got here, and a little short in terms of where we want to go. And I know that there are other efforts, including our own, that are looking at that. And, you know, as a backdrop, why is defense and resilience not enough when we think about cyber? So I think a lot of the attention has been rightfully focused on that, but in itself, it's insufficient, correct?
By itself, in and of itself, it is insufficient, but so is offense by and of its own self insufficient. This really is kind of any hammer needs an anvil, and any anvil is useless without a hammer. And so we got to get both parts of those right. There's a broad diaspora of threats in this space. Some might be simply complacency or incompetence on the part of the users. Some might be criminal elements, and they're enormously prodigious in terms of coming at us day after day. The lucrative assets they might acquire are just too attractive. And then there are a few, but they have an outsized effect, rogue nation states, or nation states that are using this as an instrument of power coming at us. We require a range of remedies to deal with those. It might well be that we can get most of the cretins off the field by just strengthening our defenses, make ourselves a harder target, right? That then would say a bias towards inherent resilience is the right strategy to deal largely with that center of gravity. But that doesn't take care of those that say, I'm coming at you anyway, and I've got the capacity and the willpower to actually kind of breach your inherent resilience, your defenses, because nothing can be made perfect. And so you need to have some remedies for them. but those complement each other. It's not a choice between those. It's an alignment of all of those. So my view is that the discussion of whether it's going to be a focus on defense, kind of inherent resilience, or a focus on imposing consequences is a false choice. There was a great kind of beer commercial years ago. I won't advertise the beer, but the tagline on that was "less filling, great taste." Turns out that both of those things were true, and the competition between those two parties was not rational.
Well, very well said, and love the tie back to less filling, great taste. So I want to sort of jump into, and this is a topic you and I have discussed for many years, not many days, but looking at, and I think you talked about how resilience can be an element of our deterrent strategy. That's one part of the one side of the coin. The other side is obviously a willingness to impose cost and consequences on bad cyber behavior. I'd be curious. You want to lay out a little bit of the articulate your views in terms of cyber deterrence?
Yeah, so the McCrary report that was the stimulus for this discussion, I think, does a really nice job of looking over the shoulder and saying, what did we define deterrence as in an age of great power competition, where the principal resource on the field in terms of the end game was a nuclear weapon? That was a very different world,
Mm-hmm.
and it was one where what we really needed to do was to make sure the weapon was never used. Deterrence was a binary proposition; it was absolute. We need to make sure that thing never showed up. And therefore, the means and methods we would employ had a different outcome in mind in terms of the absoluteness of our success. But tucked inside of that, deterrence was and deterrence remains an attempt to change the decision calculus of somebody that's going to do something you don't want them to do. We're still dealing with human beings. They're today using cyber weapons more than kind of perhaps nuclear weapons on a daily basis. And therefore, we can still change their decision calculus. And how do you do that? For millennia, we've known you can change somebody else's decision calculus by making it such that if they aspire to do something, if you make it harder for them to do it, they'll think twice about whether they're going to expend the effort to do that. Inherent resilience kind of fills that gap. If you actually stoutly defend the thing that they're after, then they might think twice about kind of wanting to get caught in the bargain. If you say, I'm going to impose a cost on you, if I catch you doing it, again, you're kind of affecting their decision calculus. All of those add up to the possibility that cyber deterrence is viable. But we have to have some humility about how successful we can be of being complete in keeping that adversary off the field. We're not going to be able to do that.
Well said. And ultimately, I hate coming back to the analogy, but I do. It's like any football team. You're not going to win the national championship, neither Miami nor Indiana, if they are all offense or all defense. You've got to be able to integrate all those pieces together.
Let me borrow that analogy. I've known football teams in the past that played defense on one field and offense on another. The two sides never showed up at the same time on the same field. It never works.
Well said. Well said. So just turning to the offensive discussion just a teeny bit. What do you think some of the day-to-day battle rhythm goals are? I mean, clearly we have some very exquisite capabilities, and I think there have been some policy dilemmas that maybe we haven't fully addressed, and authorities and the like. But I'd be curious what you think that looks like in a day-to-day environment.
Yeah, I think policy matters. But before I get to that, I would just say, what are the aspirations of a policy maker or a combatant commander in the case of U.S. Cyber Command for the use of cyber power? They want it to work when and where they need it. And they might not be able to predict in advance precisely where that is. It might be that we're going to wake up tomorrow and there's a new area where we want to impose a consequence using cyber assets, or there's a new threat where we want to defend, again, by, with, and through the use of digital infrastructure. And if cyber can't deliver on a no-notice proposition anywhere in the world against any adversary, kind of perhaps some that we haven't fully anticipated, then it can't be completely strategic. It's something that you begin to doubt as to whether this really has a role to play in the panoply of other instruments of power that actually are quite, willing and able to kind of have a no-notice proposition. There was a study the Defense Science Board did, I think it concluded in about 2018, called Cyber as a Strategic Capability. And what it really tried to get to the heart of is, how do you make cyber meet the aspirations that I just described, which is when you turn to it and say, I need you now here, it doesn't say, give me 3 months. And that is less about policy. Policy has to enable what I'm about to describe than it is about familiarity with the terrain, muscle memory necessary to navigate that terrain, agility and the delegation of initiative necessary for the people and the technologies on that terrain to adjust to changing circumstances.
Hmm.
If you can do those, then cyber can step up and become a truly strategic capability. So you need to make sure you understand what your aspirations are first. Then you need to set policy and the assets, and the assets are more than technology, it's people too. And then the policy and doctrine can follow to make sure that that actually is teed up to do just what you've asked it to do.
Very well said. I often say we have a lot of tactics masquerading as strategy. First, we need the strategy, and then build the tactics, techniques, procedures around that to be able to achieve some of those goals. And I think we're getting to that point. But to stick with the sports analogy for a second, for those of us who've been in DC for a while, George Michael used to be a sports analyst, and he would always say, "Back to the time machine." So let's go back. And you brought up 2018. I think NSPM, or National Security Presidential Memorandum 13, which came out in 2018, was a bit of a watershed moment. And we spent a lot of time in our paper looking at that. So I'd be curious what some of your thoughts are going back in time in terms of what it means for today.
Yeah, I do think that was an inflection point, and inflection points have a before and an after. That's why they're inflection points. They're in the middle of those two very different situations. So let me go back a little bit further. So when U.S. Cyber Command was formed, 2009, 2010, it came into IOC in 2010, its initial operating status. It was created to ensure that we, didn't simply put all the cyber assets in the same place, but I think with the aspiration that it would be a truly strategic capability against our earlier discussion. But in 2014, I'll never forget this. I think it was Secretary of Defense Hagel said something that didn't surprise anyone. We all thought it was reasonable. But in 2014, he said, we have built this thing, but we're going to use it with great restraint and kind of discretion. I perhaps added the wrong adjective. He didn't say great, but we're going to use it with restraint and discretion because we don't want to overplay our hand in this space.
Mm-hmm.
And so those that are worried that we're about to militarize cyberspace or the internet, don't worry about that. We're going to use this kind of thoughtfully, we're going to use the principles. I will kind of insert these principles. We're going to use the principles of necessity and proportionality. 2017, we saw some number of transgressions between 14 and 17 on the part of nation states, but 2017 was an eye-opening year. In the spring of that, North Korea did something called WannaCry, which took down vast infrastructure. The national health system in the United Kingdom went down. The summer of 2017 was NotPetya, which the Russians were going after the Ukrainians, but that thing escaped. And it brought down broad swaths of our critical infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a lesson that perhaps our restraint was escalatory. So 2018 then was the kind of the inflection year. You've mentioned NSPM 13. The guts of that were classified then, have been complemented by further presidential decision orders, which I think remain classified. But what it did was to fundamentally change the delegation of authority to organizations like Cyber Command as to when and where they could engage adversaries. Gave them an envelope and said, within this, for some well-defined, upfront, well-defined envelope, you may proceed and execute, my word, a campaign. Mm-hmm. You can go after them without coming back to say, mother may I, for each discrete, kind of fire. But there were two other things that happened in 2018, and the paper, I think, brings these out. One is there was a declaration by the Congress in law that cyber operations were traditional military activities. And what that does is to allow some degree of delegation with the attendant responsibility to meet to live within a collateral effects envelope. We're going to give you the authority to do this with some initiative to balance, but you're accountable to make sure it does what it's supposed to do. And it doesn't have any perhaps kind of significant negative consequences. And the third piece was the creation and deployment of strategy we know today as defend forward, and a sub piece of that, which is persistent engagement. We're not going to wait on shore for these things to arrive and then kind of cede the initiative to adversaries. We're going to engage these things as these threats are on the rise, so that we have the highest possible leverage and the earliest possible opportunity to deal with those threats. That's not a provocative activity. Secretary Hagel in 2014 would have been pleased in 2018 we had not actually entered into an era of provocation. What we've said is that if there's a provocation out there that would hold us at risk, we're going to engage it. And so I think that was the trifecta year. At the core of that, to your point, was NSPM 13. But it was really important that cyber was described as a traditional military activity, and that we then kind of lived that dream by saying we're going to engage these activities that hold us at risk, highest possible leverage, earliest possible opportunity.
Chris, I'm really glad you jumped into defend forward and persistent engagement. I was clearly going to ask that question. In very plain terms, what does that mean? I mean, I know in our world we live that, but I'd be curious in plain terms, what do you think that entails?
If you know that there's an adversary or perhaps somebody who is going to use cyber power to your detriment, if you know that that's true, you have sufficient evidence for a range of insights. Maybe it's intelligence, maybe it's diplomacy, maybe you just read the news. You shouldn't wait back to figure out what they're going to do with that as they arrive inside your network, as they essentially kind of hit your perimeter. You should, as we have done for millennia, move forward and use the assets you have to persistently understand what are they doing, how are they using those, how are they holding you at risk, and when you find it necessary to actually suppress those things that are holding you at risk. Again, the provocation comes from them, not from us. Then you forward defend, meaning you go as far forward as possible, right, to hold those kind of in check. And defend forward as defined by the U.S. Defense Department was essentially something that was always intended to be done in coalition, right? That we would kind of find who were the parties that owned the infrastructure on which we needed to operate, and open up a collaboration with them so that we could help them defend their infrastructure. And in so doing, the lens through which that might be perhaps aimed at us within the United States. The long story made short, it's really a defensive play that's proactive, as opposed to the leading edge of a provocative offensive play. And we've done this with defense attaches, with diplomats, with legal attaches forever. Why would we not do this in cyberspace?
Yeah, that was a beautiful explanation on a complex matter. So thank you for that. And I want to stick with the in simple terms sort of concept. A lot of discussion around Titles 10 and Title 50. Title 10 being armed services, Title 50 being intelligence, and the synchronization. Can you give a little bit of backdrop in terms of why that matters? What is an intelligence operation? What is military? And obviously where they blur?
Well, it's a pity we only have 30 minutes and we've consumed some amount of that.
But you did it so well in terms of defend forward. So I've got to ask.
Well, I mean, this is really, it's important to understand history. There was a time when domestic security and foreign or national security outside of our borders was not just distinct in terms of geography, but it was distinct in terms of the parties that were accountable to try to actually deliver it. Right? Domestic security, we have law enforcement organizations. We have the governance that is attendant to the federal bureaucracy, the Congress, the judiciary, state, local, territorial, and all of that for most of our history has worked, right? Such that we could, within our borders, essentially do what was necessary to achieve the order and stability that we need for this society to move forward. Outside the country, right, it's a different matter. Right. And we all are keenly aware of World War II, or keenly aware of the global war on terror. It requires a different level of focus and different authorities. Now, that doesn't kind of cleanly explain the difference between Title 10 and Title 50. But Title 50 essentially is born of history, where Title 50 they were intelligence capabilities focused outside the United States to essentially try to understand what foreign efforts, foreign initiatives. I hesitate to say nation states
Hmm.
because Al Qaeda might not be a nation state, but what foreign activities would hold us at risk? And Title 50 was largely defined to focus on that and not to focus on domestic intelligence. Why? Because the homeland is handled in a fundamentally different way. And the rights and privileges of U.S. persons, that's not just U.S. citizens, but that's people who have the right to live here or people who just are here legally in the moment. They deserve a different standard in terms of how we're going to achieve order, discipline, stability there. So Title 50, focused on the intelligence purposes, was focused overseas. But part of the reason we kind of had this surprise on 9/11 was that the NSAs, the CIAs of the world were hugely focused overseas. The FBI was focused domestically using their own title, Title 18. And there was a seam, and kind of nature finds and exploits seams. That
Hmm.
happened on 9/11.
Hmm.
Title 10 is an authority in law that defines the authorities of the combatant assets that we had. How do we manage violence? We don't manage violence within the United States. We manage violence abroad, right? We deploy our armies, our navies, our air force to defend the sea lanes or to essentially impose consequences on others by, with, and through the appropriate application of military authorities. That's not something that we apply domestically, right? And so Title 10 was for the military focused overseas. Now, they were defined as I just described in a way that was rational in the day. But when you get to cyberspace,
Hmm.
it turns out that the Title 50, which is trying to get information from cyberspace, and the Title 10, which is trying to actually achieve effects in cyberspace, are about 90% the same, right? What you need to do is to understand the nature of the territory, cyber. You need to actually kind of make your way along that, perhaps cracking through a firewall or kind of holding something at risk so that you can open a door and you can insinuate yourself in. And only in the last 5 to 10% of the operation do you do what you actually showed up to do, which is to take perhaps some information back and constitute through Title 50 lenses and authorities information to help the nation understand what risks there are in the world. Or in the last 5-10% to say, now I'm here at the moment, I can close the trap and I can impose a consequence on some presumed adversary. The first 95% of Title 10, Title 50 in cyberspace is the same. And it actually defies kind of our realization of experience in the physical world. We got there insidiously. It wasn't something that we knew going into the prosecution of activities in cyberspace, say 25, 30 years ago. But here we are. That's why it's so kind of difficult. And if you remove the boundary between Title 10 and Title 50, all of a sudden, all these other protections about how do we defend the homeland in a particular way, how do we defend U.S. person privacy in a particular way, they might go out, that baby might go out with the bathwater. I perhaps have made this more complicated than not, but it's the nature of the dilemma. How do we actually get these things exactly right?
That was exceedingly well articulated, and I might just add, looking back to the global war on terrorism and in a post 9/11 environment, syncing up those authorities doesn't just happen on its own. We don't just press a button. It takes scar tissue. It takes being in the same foxholes. It takes experience. It takes trust, and it takes some time. And ultimately, that culminated, at least in my eyes, to a JSOC sort of capability, Joint Special Operations Command. But I think we're at the evolution now where we're seeing what that could and should look like. But to get there, it's going to take some time, and ultimately, you need to know where you want to end up. So I think I get back to some of the strategy, because when I look at cyber capabilities, people often look at a capability is different than integrating it into your warfighting strategy, doctrine, and everything else. And I think that's precisely where that recalibration is today. Disagree with me, but when I go
I
back
don't
to
actually, sir.
9/11, I think that
So
was
my
arguably the
experience, my
greatest
experience, some of
success.
which I've learned from others, some of which I've actually experienced, kind of would say that you're exactly right. Look, I'm a long time kind of creature byproduct of the United States Air Force. And I was taught early on that the reason they took the Air Force away from the Army, no offense to people who love the Army on this podcast, the reason they took the Air Force away from the Army is that the Army thought that the Air Force was long range artillery. and therefore had a limited view of what it might then achieve. So the capability wasn't the issue. The doctrine, the aspirations, and the use of that was the issue,
Exactly.
which is why we then now today have an Air Force that thinks about air power and air supremacy, and that doctrine which transcends merely long-range artillery or close air support or all the other manifestations of that. I think we have to go through the same thinking in terms of what is cyber? What is cyber power?
Hmm.
And for what purposes would we employ that? In the absence of that strategy, nothing can be strategic.
You know, over the holidays, and none of us have the details, and if we did, we wouldn't be talking about them specifically, but absolute resolve. You saw a culmination of cyber and publicly discussed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the president, and others, the role that cyber played in this particular campaign. Anything in particular that stood out for you, Chris?
Well, first, I would kind of give the caution you had, which is that neither of us want to talk about classified information. I don't think either of
Never
us
would.
have it. But I'll go on the basis of what I heard the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff say, which is that cyber did play a role. I'm comforted by two things. One, that cyber as an instrument of power was in play. It's not something we use simply because we had it, but if we're going to do something that requires the application of Title 10 authority and the resources that are then attendant to that Title 10 authority, then cyber either plays or it doesn't, right? And cyber played. Right. Second, it was an instrument of power. It wasn't the instrument of power. Right. It was part of a larger campaign that achieved some effects that ultimately all of those were after some larger strategic aspiration. We can argue whether that strategic aspiration was the right one or was at the right time. But if you look at the execution of the United States military and the resources that it brought to bear, cyber looked like it was integrated. And I was comforted by that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I might note not to go back to nuclear deterrence because we are looking at this very differently. But as the line in the Doctor Strangelove movie went, "What good is having the doomsday machine if no one knows you got it?" I think part of this is also signaling publicly, and I'm actually happy we're discussing this publicly because it's putting some of our adversaries on notice, right? It's not just the direct adversary, it's everyone else watching.
But yeah, that is both boon and bane, right? So I agree with you. But sometimes the right choice is to not use it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes the right choice is to say there's a better tool, right? And so we need to always think about what's the kind of the transcendent strategic aspiration, maybe for some military objective that is subordinate to some national security objective. And then what's the right set of tools to bring to bear? And what is really useful about the American approach, which is not unlike our allies' approach, is the integration, is more important than the application of any one of the silos. Look, I kind of came a long way in the Air Force, active and reserve, and it was very clear to me at the outset that I needed to develop a competence that was useful on some battlefield, but that was going to be applied in combination with all the other assets on that battlefield. If I didn't understand joint, if I didn't live joint, or kind of in the coalition, if I didn't understand what coalition warfare was, then I was going to be no good whatsoever. I couldn't live in my stovepipe and say, yeah, I've done the air thing. We've dominated the airspace. If we still lost the war, then all of the parties that failed to integrate, that failed to understand the transcendent piece, were accountable. This thing is wider than it is tall, despite the fact that sometimes we fall in love with the depth kind of the silos within which we live.
Love it, love it. We're in a new year. It's 2026. What's one thing that's got you most excited about where we're going, and what's the one thing that keeps you up at night, most concerned?
I think what's got me excited, and sometimes optimism is its own reward. So, it might be an
Well said.
unrequited
Yeah,
aspiration here.
yeah.
But what's got me most excited is that the questions that are being asked, I think, are the right questions, right? What are our strategic aspirations? What do we have as expectations of the contribution by the various assets we can bring to bear? And it's not just technology, which is so often the thing that's fixating in this realm in cyberspace. But what's the right skill? What's the right doctrine? What's the right degree of integration? What's the video look like as opposed to the picture, the snapshot of the capabilities that we would put up? kind of in some arsenal or on some org chart. And I think the questions that I hear kind of in my daily bump and grind are much more thoughtful than we knew how to be 15, 20 years ago. I think we ask the right questions and we kind of tap the right people, we'll get some good answers. And then the muscle memory based upon actually applying those, putting those in harm's way, will iteratively get us to a better place. As you mentioned, right, it looks to me through an unclassified lens, like Cyber Command and the cyber assets made a difference, a discernible, useful difference, right, in the Venezuela campaign. There was also a public note by the Secretary of War that it made a difference in the attacks on Natanz earlier or mid-2025. So I think that we've got plenty of opportunity to employ this, not because we want to, not because we simply have it, but because we need to. And the questions seem to be kind of helping us understand how to do that in the most strategic way possible. What keeps me awake at night? We don't have time, right? We're way behind the curve. So when you look at what, in particular, Russia and China have done to think their way through the use of cyber as an instrument of power and their integration of that into the way that they hold others at risk or they deploy and realize their own strategic aspirations, we might win in a head-to-head contest of any particular capability taken unto itself in isolation. But I don't think we're in a great place in terms of the integration of all of that. In part because the rules that we're living by, which is very appropriate, we follow. But the rules we're living by were designed for an earlier time when this degree of natural integration didn't exist. There was a distinction between home and away. There was a distinction between cyber and kinetic. All of those distinctions are increasingly being worn away. And the Chinese and the Russian kind of national security institutions are in some cases leading that deterioration, but in all cases taking advantage of it.
Chris, thank you for your wisdom, your commitment. Thank you for all the support you provided us in putting together this report. I might note, and this is a combination of your positive and negative. I've long said for too long we've let our adversaries shape our strategy. We're reacting to whatever they do, and that becomes our strategy. I think we're at the point where maybe we can shape that and get ahead of the game. I'm often told an optimist is a pessimist with experience. I'm still an optimist, not always easy, but I'm optimistic because I get to work with great people like you. So, Chris, thank you. Thanks for all you're doing, and keep fighting the good fight.
Back at you, Frank. Thanks very much for the opportunity to kind of work alongside the McCrary Institute and you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Cyber Focus. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing. Your ratings and reviews help us reach more listeners. Drop us a line if you have any ideas in terms of topics, themes, or individuals you'd like for us to host. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and stay curious.